Welcome to Have You Read It, the channel where we bring books to life, one summary at a time. Today, we're diving into Peter S. Goodman's How the World Ran Out of Everything, a compelling exploration of the 2021-2022 supply chain crisis. Goodman doesn't just recount the shortages, he digs into the systemic issues that made us so vulnerable. He uses the journey of a single container of Elmo bath toys from a Mississippi startup as a microcosm of the larger breakdown. The book unfolds in 3 parts, mirroring the journey of that container. Part 1 examines the disruption's origins in China, the world's factory floor. Part 2 follows the container's turbulent trip across America, revealing dysfunction in trucking and rail. Finally, Part 3 explores potential solutions, from nearshoring to reshoring. Let's start in Mississippi with Hagen Walker, the owner of Glow, the company making those Elmo toys. Walker preferred making his products in the U.S., but the reality of 21st century manufacturing led him to China. It wasn't just about cost, it was about having all the necessary components, raw materials, and manufacturing expertise in one place. This was the path of least resistance, a path paved by decades of globalization. Walker's experience echoed a larger trend. American manufacturing had declined, while China had become the go-to source for everything. In following this trend, Walker wasn't just making a business decision, he was participating in a system built by multinational corporations, chasing lower costs and fatter profits. This system, as Goodman illustrates, was far from risk-free. The pandemic revealed the folly of over-reliance on a single country, especially when that country was locked in a trade war with the U.S. Let's rewind to understand how we became so dependent on China. Goodman argues that American corporations, not China, were the primary culprits in the decline of U.S. manufacturing. They chased profits, sending jobs overseas while reaping the rewards. The narrative around China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 perfectly illustrates this dynamic. American businesses and politicians, including President Bill Clinton, framed China's inclusion as a victory for democracy, arguing that economic freedom would lead to political freedom. This rhetoric masked the real motivation: access to cheap labor and a massive new market. The reality, however, was far different. China's economic rise didn't bring democratization. It solidified the Communist Party's control, fueled military expansion, and led to human rights abuses like the repression of Uyghurs. Back to the present, and Walker's Elmo order. He chose Platform 88, a Ningbo-based company run by an American, Jacob Rothman, to manufacture the toys. Rothman, a veteran of Chinese manufacturing, could navigate the complex supply chain and ensure quality. However, the pandemic was causing disruptions. Factories struggled to find workers and raw materials. Walker, heeding Rothman's advice, placed the biggest order in Glow's history, hoping to get ahead of the problems. But this was just the beginning of his ordeal. The pandemic had revealed a fundamental weakness in the global economy: lean manufacturing, or just-in-time. This system, pioneered by Toyota, aimed to minimize waste by having parts arrive just as they were needed. But it left little room for error. Taiichi Ohno, the architect of Toyota's production system, was obsessed with eliminating waste. His insights transformed Toyota and influenced manufacturers worldwide. The key was to produce only what was needed, when needed, and in the amount needed, like a supermarket stocking milk. This seemingly simple idea, however, became distorted. Consultants, eager to boost shareholder profits, turned just-in-time into a mandate to slash inventory. They traded resilience for short-term gains, leaving companies like Glow vulnerable to disruption. Goodman refers to the most extreme proponents of this approach as the lean Taliban. They pushed companies to minimize inventory, even at the expense of customer service. This short-sighted approach left the supply chain exposed to the very shocks it was supposed to prevent. The results of this philosophy were evident even before the pandemic. The Taiwan earthquake in 1999 and the Fukushima disaster in 2011 both disrupted chip production and caused shortages. These events should have been wake-up calls, but each time, the commercial world reverted to its lean ways. The chip shortage during the pandemic was a perfect example. Automakers, initially anticipating a drop in demand, canceled chip orders. When demand unexpectedly surged, they couldn't get the chips they needed, forcing production cuts. This brings us to the next leg of Elmo's journey: shipping. The cost of shipping a container across the Pacific had increased tenfold, and finding an available container was nearly impossible. Walker was caught in the crosshairs of a shipping crisis. To understand this crisis, Goodman traces the history of container shipping. Malcolm McLean revolutionized global trade by introducing standardized steel boxes that could be easily moved between ships, trucks, and trains. This innovation made shipping cheaper, faster, and more efficient, but it also concentrated power in the hands of a few large carriers. The deregulation of the shipping industry in 1998 allowed these carriers to operate like a cartel, setting prices and prioritizing their largest customers. They exploited the pandemic-induced chaos, charging exorbitant rates while smaller businesses struggled to get their goods on board. This deregulation was sold to the public and politicians as a way to increase efficiency and lower prices for consumers. However, it ultimately harmed competition and made the supply chain more fragile. American exporters, particularly agricultural producers like almond growers, were hit even harder than importers. With carriers prioritizing lucrative imports from Asia, agricultural exports were often left behind, rotting in warehouses. These exporters, traditionally allies of the big retailers who also relied on shipping, now found themselves competing for the same scarce resources. This was a direct result of the carriers' focus on maximizing profits on their Asia-North America routes. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 aimed to address the shipping crisis by giving more authority to the Federal Maritime Commission. But the Commission, historically weak and industry-friendly, faced an uphill battle against the powerful shipping giants. The Commission's chairman, Dan Maffei, acknowledged the problems, but didn't fully embrace the White House's rhetoric about cracking down on the carriers. He was wary of disrupting the system further, highlighting a fundamental tension: the U.S. economy's dependence on foreign-controlled shipping. Back to Elmo's journey. The container finally reached Long Beach, but the ordeal was far from over. It now had to travel across the country, and the American transportation system was buckling under the strain. This brings us to part 2 of the book, focusing on the domestic leg of the container's trip. Walker initially considered rail, but the American rail system was a mess, thanks to decades of cost-cutting and consolidation under the guise of precision scheduled railroading. This system, much like just-in-time, was supposed to increase efficiency, but in practice it meant cutting staff, delaying trains, and prioritizing profits over service. The railroads, like the shipping companies, were maximizing shareholder value at the expense of the supply chain's resilience. Goodman argues that this dynamic goes back to the robber barons of the 19th century, who treated railroads as tools for personal enrichment rather than vital infrastructure. This history of looting and prioritizing shareholder profit continued with the deregulation of the railroads in 1980. The parallels between the railroads and other industries are striking. The pursuit of short-term profits led to long-term vulnerability. The railroads, trucking companies, and meat packers all prioritized shareholder value, often with disastrous consequences. The trucking industry, like the railroads, was facing a crisis. The narrative was a driver shortage. But Goodman argues that the real problem was not a lack of drivers, but a lack of drivers willing to endure low pay, long hours, and terrible working conditions. Deregulation in the 1980s had led to a surge in competition and a decline in driver pay. Trucking companies, rather than improving working conditions, lobbied for government subsidies to train more drivers, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation. The meatpacking industry provided another stark example of how corporate greed exacerbated the supply chain crisis. Meatpacking plants became COVID-19 hotspots, but companies, with the Trump administration's support, prioritized production over worker safety, even as profits soared. This was enabled by a false narrative of a meat shortage, despite ample inventory. This narrative, fueled by the meatpacking lobby, served to keep plants open and profits high, even at the cost of workers' lives. The common thread through these industries was the concentration of market power in the hands of a few giant corporations. This allowed them to manipulate prices, exploit workers, and prioritize short-term profits over long-term stability. The pandemic didn't create these problems, it exposed them. This brings us to Part 3, Potential Solutions. Walker, disillusioned with China, explored Vietnam as a manufacturing alternative, but he found that even Vietnam relied heavily on Chinese components, highlighting the difficulty of truly diversifying. Other companies, like Taylor Schupe's Future Stitch, turned to reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. This move, often driven by political considerations and government subsidies, offered a solution to geopolitical risks and rising shipping costs. Many companies opted for a middle ground, nearshoring, or moving production to nearby countries like Mexico. This offered the advantages of lower costs and shorter shipping times without the geopolitical risks of China. Mexico, once demonized by politicians like Ross Perot and Donald Trump, became an attractive alternative. Its proximity to the U.S., combined with lower labor costs, made it a prime destination for companies seeking to de-risk their supply chains. These shifts, however, didn't necessarily solve the fundamental problems. Even with regional hubs, companies still relied on lean manufacturing and prioritized shareholder value. The risk of future disruptions remained. Automation, touted as a solution to labor shortages, also posed a threat to workers. Robots and driverless trucks could further erode working conditions and wages, unless workers gained a say in how automation was implemented. By early 2023, some signs of recovery were evident. Shipping rates dropped and some companies increased wages. But the fundamental issues remained. The drive for efficiency and shareholder profit could easily lead to another crisis. So, what's the main takeaway? Goodman argues that the Great Supply Chain Disruption wasn't just a temporary blip. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, a system that prioritizes short-term profits over long-term resilience and worker well-being. To prevent future crises, Goodman suggests several key changes. Rethink efficiency. The pursuit of efficiency should not come at the expense of resilience, worker safety, or environmental sustainability. Just-in-time should be balanced with just-in-case. Embrace regionalization. Diversify supply chains by relying on regional hubs, reducing dependence on a single country. Revive antitrust enforcement. Break up monopolies and promote competition to prevent price manipulation and exploitation. Empower workers. Ensure fair wages and working conditions to create a stable and motivated workforce. These changes, Goodman argues, are not just about fixing the supply chain. They're about building a more just and sustainable economy. Thanks for watching. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next book dive.